for inviting me here. It's just fun to be here. There's an excellent reputation for the School of Education, and in particular the Math Education Research Group here at Rutgers, and this is the first excuse I've ever had to visit campus, so this is one thing. And thank you for your introduction, Keith. I'll say, although my research has seemed pretty varied, I'll tell you the one anchoring thing that will become apparent by the end of the presentation, that what I'm mostly interested in is mathematical epistemology. What is mathematics? How do we learn it? How do we have access to this, what some people characterize as truth, or the language of the universe, or something like that? I don't necessarily agree with those characterizations, but there's reasons why we think about mathematics that way, as being certain or truth or truth. So that, for me, connects everything I'm talking about today. Any work I did on fractions was kind of an instantiation of mathematical epistemology. If we could understand how children develop early number or fractions, and we could build psychological models of that development, then what we're really understanding is the nature of mathematics itself. So maybe that'll become clear. Anyway, y'all recognize this? So it's a little part of a famous painting by Michelangelo. There's so much you can read into this. One of the things not so related to my talk that I like is this is the hand of God, and this is the hand of Adam. The painting is called The Creation of Adam. It's on top of the Sistine Chapel. And look how earnestly God is reaching out. Look how lazily Adam's sort of like, okay, I guess if you want to touch fingers, that's cool with me. But anyway, this is called The Creation of Adam. I'm not bringing it up for religious purposes, but I think you can read a lot into this scientifically. And it's not just sort of overlaying or imposing something on Michelangelo's work. There's some evidence that it was intentional. The first one I'll mention is a little bit more of a stretch, that this gap between the fingers might actually represent a synapse in the brain between neurons. So the title of the talk is Mathematics at Hand, and what I'll suggest is if we can think about mathematics in one of two ways, that for some of you might actually be equivalent, that mathematics is some kind of truth that's passed on from God, that it's the language of God or the language of the universe. But at the same time, where this is happening, where this connection is being made is in the hand. And I think that's especially appropriate. The more common, and then thirdly, whether or not this actually represents a synapse. A more common and more, I guess, more argued, more grounded claim is that in the larger picture, here's God, that's probably Eve, here are all the cherubim taking God to meet Adam, who's over here sitting on earth. That this cloak that enshrouds God is actually the human brain. And if you look at the brain and you look at the cloak, you'll see some really important distinctions that are common to both. Like, for example, here you can see this crease right here that might divide two major lobes in the brain. The frontal lobe and then the temporal lobe beneath. You can see it back here in the occipital lobe, which seems to be separated off, and then you can see maybe evidence of a brain stem down here. But this was first posed by, I knew I was going to do this. I can't see my notes, but I'm not the first to suggest this. This has been argued in the past that Michelangelo intentionally made this cloak to form the shape of the human neocortex. So, the more evidence of that is that Michelangelo actually studied corpses. He actually dissected human brains. So he would have a lot of knowledge about the brain and its structures. So that's another reason to believe that he intentionally did that. But that gives us more to read into this painting as a whole. Okay, so famous quote from a couple hundred years ago, mathematician chronicler said that God made the integers, all the rest is the work of man. But we actually know now that the integers are the work of children, that the integers aren't given to us either. That if anything's given to us, if anything's innate, it must be much more basic than the integers even. So there's several, Piaget working mostly in the 50s, but going all the way back to 42. And then Steffi, who's a neo-Piagetian, and then his student, Katie Ulrich, has studied integers in particular. There's a long line of research, and this is omitting much more from other perspectives that show that children actually construct integers too for more basic psychological processes. So how far can we dig, and what do we find at the bottom of that? A related question, and this is one of the reasons that we think about mathematics as truth, is here's Einstein. I don't know if this will surprise you, but Einstein actually saw mathematics as a product of human thought. He was not somebody who thought that mathematics was some kind of eternal truth that was out there that we were sort of gifted somehow. Instead, he actually sees it much the way that I'm going to present it. However, he also claims it's independent of experience, and we in math education community know that this is, that experience plays a major role in how we construct mathematics. But however you want to frame it, what is it that makes mathematics so well adapted to experiences in the world? So one example is, say, Newtonian physics. On the one hand, Newtonian physics is actually wrong. It's been replaced by theory of relativity, which is maybe being replaced by other theories in physics. But we were able to take Newtonian physics, which had to do with our experience on the Earth, extend that using mathematics to say something about how heavenly bodies move, and then put people in a rocket and shoot it off to the moon, and it actually landed where we thought it would based on this mathematically developed model. That's pretty amazing. How is it that mathematics gives us the ability to predict things that are well outside of our experience? All of our experiences up to that point, at least direct human experience, outside of, I guess, Russian orbit of the Earth, had been on the Earth itself. And here we are using mathematics to extend a theory of physics, and which itself wasn't truth, but still good enough to, to start space travel. So that's Einstein's question. And then maybe a more traditional answer up to that time is offered by Galileo, who of course actually predated Einstein. But this is more of a Platonist perspective. This is what you might see kind of more commonly, at least up until recent years, that the universe is written in the language of mathematics. That mathematics is something sort of just out there, and if you understand that language of numbers and shapes, that you can read the universe, because that's just what the universe is. And so I'm going to suggest, taking Einstein's question very seriously, that there is something powerful about mathematics and extending our knowledge from our experience to things we've never experienced. Take that very seriously, but this to me is kind of an easy out, and it's also one that I think is refuted by understanding of mathematical development. So we can actually see how children develop mathematics very early on, and it's not some process of things just sort of being absorbed into the head from the universe. So how can we answer Einstein's question without adopting a Platonist perspective? So one thing about mathematics that's, at least to me, fundamental, and you can read this into various works by others, but this is just my way of kind of summarizing, that the objects of mathematics are themselves based on action. So that's powerful for two reasons. First of all, it's not some empirically abstracted experience that we're working with here. It's the abstraction of our very actions in the world. So maybe the most basic mathematical objects, like numbers, say 5, come from pointing to objects. Maybe we are working with rocks. That experience is important. That empirical experience even is important. But what we're abstracting is nothing about the rocks. What we're abstracting is the coordinations that we're making between our pointing axe and our number words. When we start to coordinate those until 5 becomes an object for us. And then it makes sense to do things like asking, what is 3 5s? Until 5 is an object, you can't really consider 3 5s, but you can make 5 an object from your more base experiences. So that initial abstraction is tied to our empirical experience, but the abstraction is not of the empirical sensory observation. It's from the actions that we're performing and the coordination of those actions. So that's one of the arrows, is that the actions become objects. Say the top arrow. The bottom arrow then is once you have a mathematical object, you can act on it. And sometimes you can act on it in ways that you actually couldn't physically act. You can actually do things that are physically impossible because you can do things with these objects that you couldn't do with rocks. I'll give you just one example. If we take a cube, and you look at its symmetries, a lot of the symmetries of the cube we can physically enact. We can rotate it about a face. We can do, I don't know if you've thought about these, but you can do vertex rotations where you pinpoint opposite vertices of the cube and spin 120 degrees. There's edge flips. There's different things you can do. But when we take into account the planar reflective symmetries of the cube, those are physically impossible to perform. So at least in a three-dimensional world that we experience. So you take a three-dimensional cube, you reflect it about a plane through its center, cut the cube in half about a plane through its center right between two of the faces, and a reflective symmetry will do this. And you just can't do that. So that's an action that becomes available to us once we have objectified the cube. Now the cube itself may be abstracted from all those actions of actually physically manipulating a cube. After all, you can't even see a cube. You can see a two-dimensional projection of a cube, but to see in your mind's eye a cube requires that you have looked at it from multiple perspectives, that you've manipulated it, that you've rotated it. So once you've done all that, then these new actions become available, which weren't available in the physical actions that were used to construct the cube. So you have these experiences, rotating things around. Maybe that helps you construct an object of the cube. Now that it's objectified, that's that top arrow, you can perform new actions on it, like planar reflections. It opens up new possibilities for mental action. So this is summarized really nicely. This guy's not even a mathematician. He's a poet. This is what poets are for, saying things really nicely that we might understand but couldn't say so eloquently. Actually, it's written in French. This is a translation. It's probably better in French. But anyway, mathematics is the science of acts without things, and through this, of things that one can define by x. And that's just what I mean. That's just what I mean in this diagram. So where does that start? Neurologically, we have to start with actions, and these are physical actions that we perform in the world. I'm just going to talk about the neocortex. There are 4 major lobes in the neocortex. You've got down here the temporal lobe, and this is sitting right about here is where your ear is. Temporal lobe kind of sits behind, in between your ears, low, around here. So it makes sense that there's a lot of auditory processing, a lot of language processing that's happening in your temporal lobe. And then back here is your occipital lobe. So it's like this part. It may not make sense at first, but when you consider that the eyeball is right here and that there's an optic nerve that goes directly back, even though it seems that the occipital lobe is farthest from the eye, it kind of makes sense that the occipital lobe is involved in visual processing when you consider the eye is kind of seated in here and has a nerve going straight back. So that's the occipital lobe. And then you have the 2 lobes that I'm going to talk about that are most important for mathematical development are the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe meets the temporal lobe about here and meets the occipital lobe at about here. So you've got this area. It's the parietal lobe. And this is on both hemispheres, your left and your right hemisphere. It's up here. So parietal is from this yellow back. I meant that to be orange. I was going for Virginia Tech colors. Frontal is from this maroon forward. Right where they meet, and I think this is important, right where they meet is the sensory motor cortex. So part of the sensory motor cortex is in the frontal lobe, part of it's in the parietal lobe. The frontal region is the motor area. This is actually where your mind where your mind sends a signal for your body to move. So you want to move your hand, for example, or then an area right around here in the motor area is going to be activated. It's going to send a signal straight down your spine. It's going to fire those nerves so that they tighten your muscles or you can coordinate them however. And then a signal sent back. Signal sent back through your spine straight up to this area. Not back to the motor area, but to the somatosensory area. Somatosensory just means like sense of like not just sense of touch, it's sense of like, you can close your eyes and know where your arm is. So you have information about your body and where it's located in space without having to see or without having to touch anything. So that's somatosensory. So signal goes down, comes back, and that signal going down is frontal. It coming back is actually in the parietal lobe. So where they meet is a really important thing, and this is going to be important for mathematical development as well. It supports the idea also that mathematics is based on action. And first, those are physical actions. That's what we're talking about here. These are all related to physical actions, but it doesn't stop there. So this is a map of your brain. This works for both the motor area and the somatosensory area. You have the same map on right where they meet. This map exists in the motor and in the somatosensory. It's just coming back on different, one's going down in the frontal and coming back right beside it on the parietal. So you can see, for example, how important your tongue and your hand are. Not as much dedicated to, say, like your leg. It's, you don't have, obviously your legs are pretty important, but not disproportionate to your size. The kind of motor control you have to have over your legs is disproportionate to the size of your legs, whereas the tongue is disproportionate in the other direction and the hand as well. So notice the tongue, the hand, and the foot in particular, where they're located. So this is going up. This is going up my sensory motor cortex, going up. And then this is kind of coming down in the crevice. This isn't crossing over to the other hemisphere, because this occurs in both hemispheres. You know that like the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. So you have copies of this on both sides. So when it comes back down, this down is between your left and right hemispheres. It's that area where the two lobes meet. That's what it's referring to here. Okay, so here's an interesting study that actually isn't even a math education study. It's a neuroscience study that didn't ostensibly address mathematics at all. All they were doing is they were looking at subjects and asking them to look at people performing certain actions. If people performed actions with their mouth, the premotor area, so there's that motor cortex, the premotor area that's right next to where the mouth is activated. Not the motor area. The person isn't moving their mouth. It's the premotor area that would be involved with planning to move your mouth. So when I make sense of you chewing, what I'm doing is I'm sort of imagining myself or even preparing myself to chew as well. Same thing if you wave your hand. To make sense of you waving your hand, I imagine almost and even plan to move my hand myself. I can stop myself from doing it. And this might be something related to children's imitation. They don't actually stop themselves from doing it, they do it. But I have enough control that I can sort of imagine what you're doing and make sense of it without actually doing it. Same thing with the foot. These are the three areas activated, all in the premotor area of the frontal cortex. But there's a difference if you're actually acting on something. This is just you moving it. But if instead of just moving your mouth around, you're actually biting an apple or a slice of pizza or drinking from a can, not only will this area of my brain be activated when I watch you, but a corresponding post-motor area in the parietal lobe will also be activated. So this is action. This is acting on an object. This is action with the hand. This area, which we'll talk much more about later, it's the intraparietal sulcus. Intra means between, parietal, it's this lobe, and sulcus means valley. Whenever you hear the word gyrus, it means like hill. Your brain's like a large pizza. Pizza's very appropriate for today. It's like a large pizza dough, and this is your neocortex that I'm talking about. The neocortex of your brain is like a large pizza. It gets folded into the rest of your brain. Those folds are really important. Mammals with smooth neocortexes aren't as smart. So those crevices are really important. And this crevice is especially important for mathematics, and we'll see that a little bit later. So if I watch you throwing a ball, this area in the premotor will be activated, and then this postmotor area will be activated as well. So this is acting on an object. Same thing with the foot if you're kicking a ball, same thing. It's a really cool study. And again, it wasn't ostensibly about mathematics at all. So I'm going to focus on just one area, just on the hand. Because it aligns, this is the somatosensory area, and then I could also highlight the motor area. It aligns right with that intraparietal sulcus. between the superior part of the parietal lobe and the inferior part of the parietal lobe, intraparietal, between those two lobules, between those sort of parts of the parietal lobe. And then it's the sulcus, it's this crest going down. So the intraparietal sulcus has been studied a lot. Dehaney especially, French researcher who's a neuroscientist but focuses a lot on mathematics, has identified the importance of the intraparietal sulcus in things like counting, comparing magnitudes of collections. So if you see like 20 dots and 35 dots, you don't even have to count them to know that one collection is bigger than the other. Your intraparietal sulcus is activated and helps you determine which is the larger magnitude. So you see it with adding, you see it with subtracting. I mean, there's just numerous studies implicating the intraparietal sulcus in numerical computation and just number and size in general. But that's not it. Well, dyscalculia students who have trouble with magnitudes and number processing oftentimes will have reduced gray matter in that intraparietal sulcus as well. But that's not all that the intraparietal sulcus is involved with. It's not just a place for mathematical computation. In fact, no area of the brain, it's a mistake to think that we can just map one-to-one correspondence between our activities as humans and areas of the brain, for two reasons. The activity probably activates many areas of the brain that are coordinated in some kind of network, and conversely, each area of the brain is involved in multiple activities. So we can get clues about special areas like the intraparietal sulcus, but we don't want to make the mistake of just saying that it's just one thing. But it is interesting that that same area of the brain that's so involved in mathematical activity is also activated during tool use. And not just tool use, but even observing a tool. When you look at a screwdriver, your intraparietal sulcus, along with other areas of the brain, is activated above baseline, above what you would do, other kinds of normal everyday activities. You see a tool, all of a sudden your intraparietal sulcus is more activated than it was before. You see a bunny rabbit, that's not true. It's not, and actually more research has been done on graspable objects. So the intraparietal sulcus is actually activated for graspable objects, but it's activated above that baseline when the graspable object is a tool, like a spoon or a screwdriver. Okay, so what I want to talk about, going back to what I mentioned before, is I just want to briefly define what I mean by a mental action. So we talked about physical actions, we talked about acting on objects, and then I presented this model where actions become mathematical objects, and then you can act on those objects in new ways. Those actions that you can perform on internalized objects is what I mean by mental actions. And in mathematics, those mental actions, I'm going to be talking about mathematical mental actions. In mathematics, those mental actions are further distinguished by being composable with other actions. You can take two of these mental actions, put them together, and get a singular new action. And a kind of, maybe related to a kind of transitivity and closure in say, algebraic group theory. I mean, you can model these with groups because of the reversibility and the composability. But yeah, they're also reversible. So a mental action that you perform, you can undo it by doing an opposite action. I think about reversibility as perfect repeatability. In science, you look for repeatability. You want to make sure that a study is reliable. Can you repeat that study in another context or with varying some conditions? In mathematics, we have better than that. We have perfect repeatability because we can go back right to the starting point. You do something, you can undo it and do it again. So that already provides some clue about why mathematics is special among the sciences. Here's one example. This is called splitting. So just think about this task for a second, how you would solve it. So I'd say you're performing some kind of mental action right now. And if you reflect on what you actually did, it's actually hard for you to do this. It might be easier for middle school students to do this because when anything is so well developed, you kind of forget, you sort of take it for granted. But a middle school student, many middle school students, first of all, can't solve this. And the ones who can sort of feel the effortful activity that's going on here. The task is iterative in nature. I'm asking you about something that's 5 times as big as something else. So this is already 5 iterations of something else. And yet, to solve the task, you have to partition it. Both those things are mental actions, partitioning and iterating. But you have to be able to coordinate those two things as inverse operations, inverse mental actions, in order to solve this task. You have to anticipate that if this is 5 times as big as something else, that something else, this is 5 iterations of that, and that thing that I iterated must be 1 partition out of 5 in this. And it sounds complicated, but I think in this room, it's probably mostly automatic. And so empathizing with students who struggle with this is maybe an issue. Why is that important? Here's one example. We often want students not to just make fractions of the whole, but we want them to make the whole from a fraction. That would involve splitting. And there are some studies to empirically test this, affirm it. So if this is 3/5 of a whole bar, how would you make the whole bar? Well, even if you think, well, I want 2 more fifths, still you have to figure out what a fifth is. If this is 3/5, how do you get 1/5? So you can kind of see the splitting involved there. Partition into 3 parts, take one of them, iterate 5 times. So that's one context. Splitting isn't just obviously like, this isn't necessarily a fractions task, but it has strong implications for fractions. Splitting may have strong implications for other areas as well, but I'm going to focus on fractions. So here's a partitioning and an iterating task. These are the actual tasks, 2 of the actual tasks. We actually had a set of 4 for each one of these operations that we posed to middle school students in 2 different countries, and I'll show you the results later. Here's a partitioning task. If you can't read it, the stick shown below is a piece of candy. Show how someone could share it equally among 5 friends. Partitioning task. Can you see the 5 equal partitions within this given whole? This is a iterating task. Make a stick that's 5 times as long as the one shown below. So you make 5 connected copies, iterating it across. So those are partitioning and iterating tasks. Let me show you another task that's not splitting, but involves partitioning and iterating. This is called equipartitioning. I'm using Les Steffi's language here, but the name's not that important beyond a couple of slides. You just have to remember this word enough to see a couple slides later. So your piece of pie is 1/5 as big as the pie shown below. Draw your piece of pie. Well, the way a student might solve this is they might just imagine a slice, and then they might take that slice and iterate it 5 times and see if it equally partitions the whole. So they're sort of doing a sequential application of iterating and then partitioning, but they're sequentially ordered. They're going in a sequence rather than necessarily being part of the same structure. Students don't have to simultaneously understand those as inverse operations. Here's another one, kind of going the other way. What fraction is the smaller stick out of the longer stick? I could iterate that 5 times, and I think it's 5, I don't know. And I can see if it works. So actually that first task, just coming up with a slice, would involve some kind of partitioning. And then you're iterating to check the partition. So it'd be partitioning and then iterating. This one's more iterating and then partitioning. But either way, even if you solved it in the other order, it's involving some kind of sequential application of partitioning and iterating. So what Steffi had hypothesized is that if students can interiorize the operations involved, that sequential application of partitioning and iterating, if they can interiorize that as some kind of cognitive structure, he wasn't thinking neurologically, he's just thinking psychologically, a psychological model of students' mathematics. If they can interiorize that, then that's what splitting is. So basically a sequential activity becoming a simultaneous single structure in which you have partitioning and iterating as 2 sides of the same coin. One can think about splitting as the entire equipartitioning scheme realized in one fell swoop. There's the simultaneity that I'm referring to. So we wanted to test that. So we gave students the partitioning and iterating task, we gave them the equipartitioning task, and then we gave them these splitting tasks, which are like the one I showed you before. You have area, and then you have linear models, but basically the same tasks. And here are the results. If you look at equipartitioning, these are students who aren't equipartitioning, these are students that are, these are students that aren't splitting, and these are students that are. This is based on an inferences from their written responses to a set of 4 tasks. 4 tasks for splitting and 4 for equipartitioning. So looking across those clusters. You have 23 students that are neither equipartitioning or splitting. This is coming from 6th grade in a rural school in 6th grade. This is not a very high performing school, so it might not surprise us that you have 23 students who aren't even equipartitioning. But you have 14 students who are equipartitioning and not splitting. and you only have 3 that are splitting and not equipartitioning. So we can actually test this binomial relationship. If you have 17 things and you distribute them among 2 cells, which one comes first? The chances of getting a 14 to 3 is pretty small. It's 0.006. So we get a statistically significant result saying that this study shows that equipartitioning generally precedes splitting, which is exactly what Steffi hypothesized, is that students would be able to do this kind of sequential activity before they could do the simultaneous activity. So, I mean, that may, well, of course, but we didn't even know about this sequentiality or simultaneity. This is evidence that the model itself is a good model for this kind of mathematical development. Same results in China. So these are Chinese students. They're in 5th and 6th grade. 17 to 5 turns out to have a very strong binomial, significant binomial result, suggesting that equipartitioning is developmentally, it develops generally first. And then I'm going to skip over this, but this is basically showing what I'm arguing about. With splitting and partitioning, you have this path analysis showing that equipartitioning is a developmental step in the construction of splitting. If we want to talk about those numbers and what they mean later, we can. So we, based on this kind of work about splitting, we decided splitting would be a really good mental operation to study in neuroimaging. So the reason being that we have these very basic mental actions. We have this model of how it might develop that's been tested empirically with US and Chinese students. And the tasks are pretty simple. So we thought this would be an ideal candidate for trying to understand the neuroscience of mathematical development. Instead of, previous studies had studied things like adding 2-digit numbers, multiplying numbers, things like that. It's more focused on kind of school book tasks, textbook tasks, rather than any psychological model of mathematical development. So this was our launching point. We have a nifty acronym for our project. We use both EEG, electroencephalography is when you put electrodes on the scalp and they pick up electrical signals, which is great temporally because the speed of electricity is awfully fast. You can understand like at the lobe level, you can understand which lobes were activated when. It's not good spatially because, as you can imagine, the electrical activity could come from different areas and gets all mixed up by the time it's reaching your scalp. So fMRI is much better spatially. fMRI is looking at polarization of hydrogen atoms in your blood. But because it's blood goes very slowly. And just like when you're maybe working out, the blood doesn't get to the areas being used, much like muscles. It doesn't get to the neurons that are using the oxygen and needing to be replenished until a few seconds later. So temporally it's bad. Spatially good, temporally bad. Spatially bad, temporally good. So there's good reason to use both methodologies. And these are my colleagues that I've worked with. Martha Ann Bell runs an EEG lab, and Anthony Cate works in a fMRI lab. And Katie Ulrich's my math ed colleague. Okay, so this is the exact task that we posed. And I'm just going to share actually the fMRI results, because right now I'm just focused on the networks, not the temporal activations. But this task is posed. Imagine a student sliding into a kind of morbid tube that's a giant magnet, 3 Teslas. It's pretty strong, very noisy. You have to give them tasks that they can see. They have to be able to respond just by pushing a button. They can't really do much else, and even if they talk, you probably wouldn't hear them because it's kind of noisy. We had to have 2 interviews leading into this so that we understood how they were operating, so we could infer that they were operating the same way in the magnet when we really didn't have anything to go on, right? So we did a clinical interview with no neuroimaging, then we did the EEG interview and verified that they were operating the same way, and then the next week they're in the fMRI lab, and then we have to assume that they're operating the same way in the tube that they were otherwise. So they're just pushing a button when they have their response. That's what they're doing here. That's the partitioning task, so that should look familiar. So when they solve this task, what areas of the brain are activated? So these are the areas, a lot of frontal lobe activity, and then this area is going to come up every time. And I think we've sort of isolated why this area. It's called the supplemental motor area. It's for planned motor response. They're getting ready to push the button. Okay. So this area you can kind of ignore if we're right that it's total, and more evidence of this is that it's occurring in the left superior supplemental motor area, which would be controlling the right hand, which is where all the students were holding the button. So yeah, we're going to ignore that. So what you see here is a lot of frontal lobe activity, and then you see activity in the intraparietal sulcus. So to try to understand that, we looked at some previous studies. This is where I'm going to need my notes. We looked at some previous studies to see how they, whether they found similar areas being involved. So here's one. This study is actually looking at fractions. So maybe not surprising that you would see areas associated with partitioning involved in fractions tasks. But this is one of those studies, like I said, where they were looking basically at textbook kind of tasks and then just trying to see what was activated. It just happens to align nicely with partitioning for obvious reasons that I'll try to make more obvious in a minute. Okay, so this is premotor area. This is like effortful activity. It's working memory. It's cognitively demanding tasks are going to activate your frontal lobe, which is why your forehead gets warm when you're really thinking hard. A lot of blood's going there. And then this area is kind of hard to label. It sort of loops around. This is called the anterior cingulate cortex. It's conflict. It's resolving conflict. So when something isn't the way it should be, that area often gets activated. And then here's the interparietal sulcus again. So the way we interpret these results is that the conflict that I mentioned, whenever there's a really highly cognitively demanding task, not only will you see prefrontal activity, but you'll see a lot of coherence. And you can measure coherence best with EEG. You look for like the electrical waves if they're in sync with one another. If the electrical waves from the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe are in sync with one another, you can say those areas are kind of working in tandem with each other. For any cognitively demanding task, goes beyond what you can automatically do in your parietal lobe. You're going to have frontal lobe being recruited, and what you want as teachers is for that to be coherent, for those areas to be kind of working in tandem. Then you might get reorganization in the parietal lobe so that that activity too becomes automatic. Yeah, let me show you, well, let me see. So the same numerator, sorry, I haven't told you the task. These are the kinds of tasks they were posing. They were asking which fraction is bigger, 2/7 or 5/7? That's same denominator. Or they'd ask which fraction is bigger, 3/8 or 3/5? Here, same numerator. You can imagine that the same numerator tasks are going to be more challenging than the same denominator tasks. You can also imagine that in the same numerator task, partitioning is going to be more salient. Because you're thinking, oh, these fifths are bigger than those eighths, because if I partition something to 8, it's going to make smaller parts. And these were the tasks that activated those same kind of frontal regions that we found in the partitioning. So in the partitioning task, we found these frontal regions being activated, and the interparietal sulcus, those same areas were more activated in these same numerator tasks. And like I said, as the task got more challenging, there was also more activity in general in the prefrontal area and in the anterior cingulate gyrus. So here's another study. This is actually looking at what we call landmark tasks, where you're deciding whether whether an object is bisected or not. And you can see similar areas of the brain being activated. Here, though, you see inferior parietal lobe and superior parietal lobe, and not necessarily the intraparietal lobule, but these areas are right next to the intraparietal lobe. So there is some similar activity here. And I'll talk in a minute about when the IPS was actually activated. But these are the kinds of tasks they were posing. They would ask, is this bisected or not? Is this line segment bisected? And as a control task, they would say, is this top line touching the bottom line? Control task is just to make sure that there wasn't any superficial activity that was being attributed to bisection or landmark tasks, when actually it's just visualizing the thick figures. So you see the landmark task and its control, and then you see a line bisection task and its control. Line bisection is move this line segment until this move this mark until the line segment is bisected. And then the control is move this mark to the left, all the way to the left. So that's like a control, so you can isolate some of the activity. And what you get is interparietal sulcus activity for both tasks. You get activation in the left. Oh, I need the name of that. Sorry. This is why I want my notes so that I don't forget the names of areas that I don't usually look at. It's the lateral peristrate cortex. It's in the occipital lobe, so it has to do with visualizing. That's why I'm not focused on it. But you do see the interparietal sulcus being activated for both the landmark task and the line bisection task. In fact, the only difference that you see between these two is in the landmark task, you see that conflict area being activated. That, oh, that's not bisected. There's something wrong here. That's going to be conflict resolution. That's when the anterior cingulate cortex is activated. Versus these, the right frontal eye field. So this is actually sort of looking to say, trying to sort of picture things. But the important thing here is in both of these, the same hemisphere of the interparietal sulcus is being activated, and it's similar to what we found with the partitioning tasks. In fact, if I go back to this slide, the one time in this study that they found increased activity in the interparietal sulcus is when the subjects were trying to determine if line segments were bisected. Other times they were working with other irregular figures. But when they worked with line segments, that's when you saw the interparietal sulcus. And one reason for that may be is that line segments may be objects for our students in ways that these irregular figures aren't. A line segment may be a product of mental action, like sweeping, or even more basically, the saccades that we do with our eyes all the time to see. Our eyes are moving in these little direct paths all the time to make sense of visual information. So it may be that line segments are kind of internalized as objects in the interparietal sulcus, and those other shapes are not. So anyway, that was the partitioning tasks and some studies that showed the same areas. Here's the iterating task, like what I showed before. And for the iterating task, you also get activity in the parietal lobe, superior and inferior. You get the button pushing part. And then you get all this prefrontal area. And this prefrontal area is actually involved in different use of the word landscape. It's involved in like imagining a landscape, seeing landscapes, looking at a scene laid out in front of you. And that makes sense because when you're iterating a length, you have to have a landscape to iterate it in. You're sort of you're creating a landscape in your iterations. And though these areas have been studied much before non-mathematical studies in neuroscience, and it's always associated, that particular network of areas is always associated with visualizing landscapes. But again, you get superior and inferior parietal lobules activated. Similar studies, I guess, I don't have them here, but you don't necessarily have activity in the intraparietal sulcus being activated. And I don't have an explanation for that. You know, it may be that we had iterating tasks for line segments and we had iterating tasks for area models, and maybe with the area models the line segment thing was washed out. But anyway, that's what the pattern looks like. The most important thing I want to mention is that for the splitting tasks, it looks very different. So here's the splitting task again. This is what the subjects in the fMRI study were shown, and this is the activation. So button pushing, nothing going on in the frontal lobe, which is kind of surprising because you think about the splitting task is probably the hardest of the tasks. In fact, we know it's the hardest of the tasks in terms of development. Students can partition before they can split, iterate before they can split, and they can even sequentially organize partitioning and iterating before they can split. But the frontal lobe is associated with like planned motor activity, or actually planning to do something, visualizing something, very conscious, effortful activity. And all of these students were splitters. All the students in our study could split. And so they seem to be coordinating this iterating and partitioning with very little conscious effort and with very little planned motor activity. It's just happening. So there's a sort of automaticity going on there. They don't have to see a visual field to iterate out. They don't need to do that. They don't have to worry about whether something is correctly bisected or not. They're not making those kinds of judgments, apparently. They're just simultaneously organizing, partitioning, and iterating, and able to imagine a possible answer to that task without having to engage in frontal lobe activity. This area is the supramarginal gyrus. This is different from the others. The supramarginal gyrus is involved in like complex language processing. So you can see in the task, the wording is a little trickier because you're saying, this candy bar is 3 times as long. Imagine yours. Don't make one that's 3 times as long. So that's our explanation for why this area is activated. Our explanation for why this area is activated is the button push. So there's this one area left. And it's not just the superior parietal lobule. It's a specific area within the superior parietal lobule. It's only on the left hemisphere. The left anterior superior parietal lobule. So it's anterior means forward in the parietal lobe, left, and then it's in the superior parietal lobule. It's right up here. So natural question for us to ask is, why is this area of the brain being activated? Even though there's less activity overall, why is this being activated only for the splitting test and not for the iterating and partitioning tests? So we looked for studies where that area had been activated before, and they're all associated with handwriting. And keep in mind that the subjects in our study and the subjects in all these studies are right-handed students. So if you ask students to close their eyes and spell out their name, so they have to do this sort of fine motor control, and they have to be able to do it. I'm left-handed, sorry. They have to be able to do that without like any visual input. They're just organizing this fine motor activity, that area of the brain is always activated. So one researcher decided, okay, why that area? What's so important about that area in handwriting? He wanted to dig deeper. So he did a really simple study. He took right-handed subjects again, and he asked them to do one of 2 things. There's an experimental task and a control task. Here's the control task. Tap your right finger to your right thumb, right forefinger to your right thumb over and over. That's it. They did that while they were sitting in a fMRI, in the tube. And then the experimental task is this. Tap your fingers in sequence over and over like that. This did not activate the anterior superior, left anterior superior parietal lobe. This did. So what he determined is that what's involved is planning serial finger movements, planning a coordinated activity, planning out something that's like more complex. So it's not just doing an activity. It's not even if they were doing this, presumably, but if they're planning to kind of go in sequence and coordinate those activities. There's a coordination involved in this that's not involved in this. But it all has to do with the right hand. And these subjects are all right-handed. So what conclusion can we draw from that? Well, first I'll kind of summarize what we found in our own study. Partitioning and iterating both involve frontal lobe activity, either because they're imagining scenes or because they're trying to determine if they made their partitions right and they're kind of correcting that. If not, so there's a lot of prefrontal and premotor activity. We didn't find any of that in the splitting tasks, which would seem to be more difficult tasks. But again, these are splitters, and they might have been as automatic in splitting as you are. Both iterating and splitting involve activity in the superior parietal lobule, and that's involved in, that's an area that's well known to be associated with spatial transformations, rotating 3-dimensional objects in space. All of that cube stuff we talked about before, when you're doing that in your mind, your superior parietal lobule is going to be activated. But splitting involves additional activity beyond that in an area that's specifically associated with sequential finger movements. And that area is sitting pretty close to this intraparietal sulcus that has to do with hand control, but it's not that. It's above that in the superior parietal lobule. So what explanation can we provide for its role? So we know that the hand, from neuroscience in the studies in the past, that the hand is important in mathematical development, whether because we're counting on fingers or because of tool use. We already have this strong association between the intraparietal sulcus for number and the intraparietal sulcus for using your hand in some way. It's very suggestive. We can't absolutely conclude that because they're happening in the same place that it's for the same reason, but there's a preponderance of evidence that mathematical development and tool use sort of co-develop. And our findings further suggest that more advanced mental actions would recruit areas associated with the hand even when your hand's not being used. And again, that area of the that left anterior superior parietal lobule is associated with controlling the hand, which is more associated with the interparietal sulcus, but it's not just moving the hand, and it's not just watching somebody else throw a ball or use their hand, even if they're acting on an object. It's something literally, in this case, above that. So I'm going to draw an epistemological conclusion from this, and that is, it's a little bit convoluted, but the anterior superior parietal lobule, that area that's activated for splitting, may organize mental actions derived through physical manipulation of objects, which is associated with the interparietal sulcus, like partitioning and iterating. You can imagine how young children will need physical activity in paper folding, or maybe counting out blocks, or sequencing things, or there's lots of experiences that are important for young children to develop before they can split, before they can iterate and partition. So the anterior superior parietal lobule may organize mental actions derived from those kinds of physical manipulations in the interparietal sulcus in a manner that's completely analogous to the way it organizes the physical manipulations themselves. So we have physical manipulations of things being represented in the interparietal sulcus, tool use being represented in the interparietal sulcus. Activities like partitioning, at least, we saw directly. Partitioning line segments activated the interparietal sulcus. Iterating was around that area. So we see these kinds of mental actions being kind of abstracted from those physical activities in using the hand or using tools. Okay, but now partitioning and iterating are purely mental actions. I don't have to go through the manipulations anymore to imagine those actions being carried out. And this area of the brain, the anterior superior parietal lobule, that was used to organize those physical activities from which partitioning and iterating developed, is now being used to organize the mental actions that derived from those physical activities, even when the physical activity is not involved anymore. So there's a complete analogy, a neurological organization that would explain, yeah, we need this anterior superior parietal lobule to do the fine motor planning in order to do these handwriting kind of things that are associated with the hand and pencil tool use. But then the mental actions that come from that kind of tool use, partitioning and iterating, that are represented in and around the interparietal sulcus, are also being organized even when you're not using your hands. They're sitting in a tube. All they could do is push the button, and as we saw, that just activated that supplemental motor area. So that's the argument, is that you have mathematics is based in tool use even when you're not using the tools anymore, but the organization is completely analogous at a more abstract level. And so this claim is consistent with claims for embodied cognition, but where it might differ, depending on your interpretation of embodied cognition, is that the actions, although they're derived from bodily activity, aren't tied to the bodily activity anymore. You don't have premotor areas being activated as if you're imagining, as if you're planning to use that body part, like you do when you watch somebody kick a ball, or like you do when you watch somebody move their mouth. All of those kinds of things, just watching somebody use a body part, activates a premotor area as if you're planning to do that, even if you're not doing it. Even those areas, the planning to do areas, aren't activated during the splitting task. So that's where I think there might be some divergence with an embodied cognition perspective, is that at some point we may actually be divorcing, even though it's derived from physical activity, you have a divorce between mental activity and the physical activity. So a couple of implications. Manipulatives are important because you need to manipulate them. I mean, I know it's probably obvious to us all when we think about it, but it's so easy to forget. We often use manipulatives as visualization tools. But even if you just go back to that Buccino study about watching people kick balls and eat apples, if the students can't carry out the activity themselves, it doesn't help at all for them to watch you do it. There's no area of the brain to be activated. If they're watching you do something, they can't imagine themselves doing it because they haven't internalized that activity. It's not represented in their parietal lobule. So they need to actually engage in the activity. After that, visual representations may be helpful if it calls those things back to mind. And then the argument that, like in the case of splitting, I needed to attend to students' mental actions. Can they partition? Can they iterate? Can they combine those things sequentially? before I can decide, okay, are they ready to try to construct splitting? Can they already split? How might this development appear? Well, neurologically, it appears that what they're doing is they're coordinating those lower level activities. And if we attend to the mental actions that students have available, we can imagine ways that they might coordinate the available mental actions to create new mental actions like splitting. So going back to the epistemological thing one more time, this is Wigner's answer. He talks about this wonderful gift of mathematics that we can take mathematics, and even though it's derived from our experience on the Earth, we can use mathematics to extend scientific theories and put people on the moon. So he calls this a wonderful gift. I think it's got a religious undertone here. Wonderful gift that's been given to us that makes this possible. Well, if it's a gift, then I think this is where it happened. So the hand is the fundamental place where that gift transpires, and there's a lot of development from there to the kinds of mathematics that we want our students to learn. Thank you.
So I have a question. So if we're thinking about this, splitting obviously is, as a skill, is probably some sort of continuum, right? Think about it as a construct. Splitting in half is way easier than splitting in fifths or eighths, and I'm sure that none of us in the room would easily be able to split by 23 if you asked us that same question with the cancer, right? Like, I don't know what the fMRI would look like.
Yeah.
I don't know what the fMRI would look like. So the question is, the students that you were using, you said there were splitters. Two questions, I guess. Did you use non-splitters on splitting tasks, and what did their fMRI look like? Or can you speculate what might happen, you know, if students are sort of developing this and they're iterating and doing the other thing, I forget what you call it, the one with partitioning and iterating for some numbers, but splitting for half or splitting for third. I'm wondering if some splitting comes early on and you can get something where you see the frontal, it's active when they're splitting, when they're doing a 5, divide by 5, but it's no longer active when you do the half with the same child.
Yeah, we don't know because we weren't able to recruit non-splitters. We tried to, but this was a small funded study. We had 12 participants. They were all splitters. So we have plans to repeat this study on a larger scale, and we specifically want to get students who are clearly not splitting and clearly splitting, and then we're debating whether we want sort of this emerging group as well. But at least we want to see what do these neural actions look like when a student doesn't, when they're trying to solve a splitting task, but from the clinical interviews we determined that they're not splitters. Yeah, we don't know the answer to that, but you see what areas are activated in iterating and what areas are activated in partitioning. So we'd be very interested to see what's happening in and around that anterior superior parietal lobule. Do you see it becoming more and more active? Is it sort of like a continual development that they're starting to coordinate those things? Is it possible that they rely on premotor areas or prefrontal areas to start to coordinate iterating and partitioning until that's finally sort of encoded or represented in the anterior superior parietal lobule? That's a very interesting question to us, but we don't know. Yes?
So I wonder if you're talking about these students that are splitters and they know, they memorize, like they know from their experience in traditional mathematics that a fifth of one is a fifth. And I'm wondering is like what part of that memorization of that fact might play into what's happening in their brain?
Well, there are other studies that I didn't cite that compare like subtraction tasks or even addition tasks to multiplication tasks. And it's really funny because you'll see this area of the brain that'll be activated during it's the angular gyrus, will be activated a lot during multiplication tasks and not activated very much during subtraction tasks. And you ask yourself why. It's because like this is involved in sort of language processing, and in particular with sort of storing tables of information, multiplication tables in particular. So if you do sort of a naive neuroscience, what you might determine is, oh, if I want to help students engage in multiplicative reasoning, I just need to do things that will activate that area of the brain and then multiplication. But we know as math educators that no, probably a more sensible interpretation is students are just memorizing their multiplication tables, and that's why that area is involved more than with subtraction. So you get actually a horrible educational implication if you just did things that activated that area. I mean, not that memorizing multiplication tables is important, but if you just focused on that and thought that you were helping develop multiplicative reasoning, that would be a terrible mistake. So anyway, so I would say we would expect to see more activation here if what you were saying was occurring. But more than that, notice that the splitting task, partitioning task, and iterating task didn't use fractional language at all. There was no fractional language in any of those tasks. The only task where there was fractional language were actually the equipartitioning tasks, which we didn't use in the fMRI. These are those equipartitioning tasks, right? But the splitting tasks, even for that study, didn't involve fractional language. So I think it's unlikely that that's what they're doing. Also because, you know, they're dealing with different kinds of shapes and sizes, and to think that they would remember, you know, they'd have to have generalized something to be able to figure out, okay, how do I partition something into 3? Well, that's going to depend on how big the thing is. So it makes the use of memorization like less likely that they would actually have to engage in some kind of activity to partition it.
Okay, that's all the time that we have. So let's thank our speaker, Andy. Sure, he'd be willing to stick around and answer a few questions?
Yeah.
Good.
Andy, you can use those.
No, we used tests like them. It wasn't just bars. I showed the bars test, but we also did area tests. We did, yeah.